subject a taboo subject because I can guarantee you, under such circumstances, it won't go away. It will simply metastasize. And if we ever try to have Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or any of these other countries become the defenders and the jurors of free speech, we are really in a sad situation. Now, this brings us to other issues. The Global Counter-Extremism Fund, which was just announced, $200 million in a fund that is going to be chaired or established by both Turkey and the United States. It doesn't do much good to have a global counter-extremism fund if we are afraid to define what extremism is. I mean, generally speaking, I'm all in favor of religious freedom. Every Jew, every Christian, every Muslim should be the best Jew, Christian, or Muslim that they want to be and should have no impediment to worshiping how they believe. The problem with political Islamism is that it seeks to impose on others that choice and to not make it an individual decision, but to make it a state, a group decision, oftentimes enforced by violence. Now, in the last panel, we talked briefly about the Fethullah Gulen movement. And certainly we can say that it's a controversial movement. It's like the three blind men with the elephant. Depending on where you stand and what you're describing, you come to radically different conclusions. But what I worry about when it comes to the Fethullah Gulen movement, or if we look at the Fethullah Gulen movement as predominantly powerful in the Western Islamic world, if we also look in the Eastern Islamic world at the Tablighi Jamaat movement, which has become especially big, if it has its origins in India and Pakistan, it's become especially big in Afghanistan as well. Both of these movements, I worry, can become gateway movements to something more radical. And that doesn't mean that one should crack down on the free practice of association or religion, because that shouldn't be the case. But none of these groups should be seen as a panacea. This brings us to another issue with regard to democracy, and it's been a bugaboo of mine for a long time. That whenever we talk about models of democracy, Turkey, for example, traditionally as a model of Islamic democracy, no, as soon as you put an adjective in front of democracy, what you are effectively doing is endorsing the narrowing of that term. And if you have to modify democracy, admit you're modifying democracy and it's something less than full democracy. So in a situation like, and if we go further with that model, for too long we were giving Turkey, which is a major influence in the Caucasus, a free pass as being some sort of model for Islamic democracy. And unfortunately, what it has become in recent years, and this isn't about Turkey, so I won't belabor the point, is a model for how Islamist movements can be used to undercut the checks and balances inherent in a democracy. Now, another theme of the last panel, which I think can just as easily be transposed onto this panel, when we look at domestic and international responses to extremism, is the need to stand up for allies, and it should send chills down the spines of every analyst and every diplomat when Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, is bragging that the Iranians stand up for allies much better than the Americans do. We have to recognize across the Caucasus that they are not only considered by nationalists in Russia to be part of that near abroad, but also in Iran, they are often considered, they are very much, not often, they are very much considered, even by opponents of the Islamic Republic, to be part of a near abroad. You know, it wasn't meant as a compliment, but when I first got to Tehran in 1996, they used to call me, as many of you know, Pesari Shaitani Bozorg, son of the great Satan. And when they heard me speak Persian, they said I spoke Persian like an Afghan taxi driver, which wasn't meant as a compliment. They put me in a remedial class.
As an expert.
They put me in a remedial class with the North Koreans and the Libyans. It was my own little axis of evil. And as part of one of the exercises, we had a textbook where we each got assigned a different province of Iran. It would be like if second grade school kids in the United States, one had to give a presentation about Florida, another had to give a presentation about California and so forth. I got Dagestan. Now, Dagestan hasn't been part of Iran since 1828. And I wouldn't say that the Iranians want to get it back either. But the point is, it still reflected this idea of a near abroad, which permeates Iran just as much as it permeates Russia. We often talk about the near abroad just in terms of one or the other, but what makes the Caucasus so special, if you will, and not in a good way, is that they are caught between two near abroads, and therefore, three Turkey. But if you consider that they have these external pressures on them, whether you are Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Georgia, it becomes essential that the United States be willing to stand up more than rhetorically for its allies. What happened to Georgia was an embarrassment. Back when Georgia, which has positioned itself as a consistent United States ally, was more or less betrayed by the United States and our hollow response after the Russian invasion. I mean, The Onion, the satirical American paper, had a headline in which they said Condoleezza Rice, in response to a question about Georgia, warns all American allies not to border Russia. And that's not the way a proper policy should be. Now, we shouldn't ever be subverting the independence of any of these countries. That's already happened once in the aftermath of World War I. It shouldn't happen again, whether you're Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Georgia. If it comes a time where the United States and Western powers seem to be suggesting that these countries' independence, effective independence, is up for grabs, then we cannot complain if these countries reorient themselves to make, we cannot in Washington complain, if these countries reorient themselves to make accommodations to powers that otherwise they would want nothing to do with. Now, the last point I want to make, and this oftentimes comes into play with regard to the discussions of Azerbaijan in particular, is the need for the United States to support and promote the formation of a solid and stable economic middle class. The reason for that is some of the best, perhaps the best anecdote to the pressures of radicalization that are going to be coming from the North Caucasus and are going to be coming from Iran is the fact that you will have an independent middle class which understands what it has to lose and which also understands that political Islamism and extremist rhetoric is simply not a panacea. The Egyptians learned this the hard way. Let's hope that in Azerbaijan, as with the rest of the Caucasus, which have a much greater economic potential, that this economic development is let to continue, because the best opportunity for lasting reforms in a country like Azerbaijan is to have those lasting reforms be built upon a solid economic foundation, and that is something which, to Azerbaijan's credit, has occurred over the last several years. Georgia, I had left out of this because Georgia has already gone a long way to building a much more solid economic middle class, and it also doesn't face, as we heard, many of the same pressures of radicalization that perhaps other countries in the region look at. I can mention Armenia for the sake of mentioning Armenia here, but I don't want to get into a pissing match because it has nothing to do with the Azerbaijan and Armenia conflict. Armenia has its own issues with economic transparency. It shouldn't be an issue about who's more transparent, Armenia or Azerbaijan, because there certainly is room for improvement on both. But the fact of the matter is, the more solid and independent the middle class is, the better those countries will be in able to counter that notion of radicalism. And with that, let me conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least on this panel is going to be Ilan Berman.
Well, thank you, Ariel. And it's always nice to be the last speaker on what is effectively the first part of the conference, because I get to shamelessly repeat all the smart things that other people said and sort of take credit for them, and it's great. And also, I'm sort of the one standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to do this very strategically. Michael made the point earlier, which I think is a good one, it's worth reiterating, about not seeing the forest for the trees. And so I wasn't here for the entire first panel, but I was here for enough of it to appreciate how much granularity there was on particular sort of Islamist developments in the South Caucasus. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to sort of shift gears a little bit and zoom out to 30,000 feet. I'm paid to be a generalist, even though Ariel's kind enough to bill me as an Iran expert. So let me sort of highlight for you sort of the three macro trend lines that I see sort of culminating in political transitions in the South Caucasus shortly. So the first is that the GWAT, right? So for those of us who are knuckle draggers like myself and still call it the war on terror, the GWAT is clearly receding in the popular conception of the United States. We are post-September 11th, you had what was billed by us as a forward presence, what was billed by many in the region as an intrusion of the United States and of U.S. allies and of U.S. interests into the post-Soviet space, right? And I use that not pejoratively, but sort of just to describe the area writ large. But what you saw this most pronouncedly in Central Asia, not necessarily the Caucasus, but the effect was the same. There was a shift east on the part of U.S. thinking. And that shift east is becoming a casualty of our success. What you've seen over the last 2.5 years has been a post-Bin Laden retreat, at least in intellectual terms, with regard to our thinking about the problem of terrorism and how to confront it. If you'd like to be sort of brutally honest about it, what you've seen over the last 2.5 years has been a defining down of the problem of radicalization and terrorism on the part of the administration. You know this because you see how the rhetoric officially from the White House has changed from a discussion about countering Islamic radicalism to countering al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, right? And there's a very good political reason for that. The political reason for that is if you can counter al-Qaeda and only al-Qaeda, that means you can talk to the Taliban, for example. And so you've seen this sort of step backward, at least in intellectual terms. And it's a changing of the conversation that is very much self-referential. It refers to the U.S. political environment, sort of, what Americans are prepared to take on after a decade or more of war, but it has pronounced effects upon our allies, including countries in the South Caucasus. So one of the interesting, sort of the most interesting elements of the first panel that I noticed was how obliquely, and maybe not directly, but how many references there were in passing to the fact that the region is impacted by what the United States does or doesn't do. And this is particularly germane, I would point out, by the fact that the next big evolution is for us to leave Southwest Asia completely, right? We are leaving Afghanistan. And the at least partial sanitary cordon that the coalition has managed to erect, and we can argue about all day about whether or not coalition operations in Afghanistan have been effective, whether or not we could do more, whether we should stay, whether we should go. But the reality is that the type of Western action that you've seen in Afghanistan has at least partially constrained the type of radical flows that you are likely to see move unfettered from south to north in the absence of a restraining coalition presence. So that's the first trend. The second trend is that, as Svante talked about in the first panel, Russia is exporting instability. And it's exporting instability. We often talk about Russia exporting instability as part of state policy and to undermine the political independence and sovereignty of neighboring countries, which it still covets as part of a sort of a neo-imperial impulse. That's certainly true, and the ambassador talked about that a little bit, and I think it's worthy of larger conversation. But I want to refer to something different. Russia is exporting instability as a function of its failure. Function of its failure both in strategic terms and in demographic terms. Right? Strategically, what you've seen in Chechnya over the last 2 decades has been the metamorphosis of what originally started as a self-determination conflict become a grinding, bloody civil war with missionary Islamist overtones, right? The Chechen conflict has materially changed, and it's also metastasized. So whereas the Russian government officially says, you know, we're done, we've declared victory, you know, we've pacified the region, the empirical data suggests that they've done nothing of the sort. In fact, the conflict has become more diffuse. It's begun to affect, in a very real sense, adjoining republics, Dagestan, Ingushetia. Beyond that, Kabardino-Balkaria, and even migrated into the Eurasian heartland, into places like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. This is huge because it upsets the traditional compact that the Russian government has established with the Russian people, which is that Chechnya may be ugly, Chechnya may be blinding, but Chechnya is far away. And it's not going to affect those of you that live in Moscow, it's not going to affect those of you that live in St. Petersburg, out of sight, out of mind. It's increasingly difficult to suggest that Russia's struggle with Islamic radicalism is out of sight, out of mind when it's happening in your own oblast, in your own krai, in your own region. And this is a challenge that the Russians are going to face. It's also a challenge that the Russians are going to face demographically. And I don't want to dwell too long on this, but just to point out that the demographic decline of Russia, which I think is sort of more or less a pretty evident and pretty commonplace assertion, is not uniform. By comparison, Russia's Muslim minority is faring pretty well. Russia's Muslim minority, you know, according to back-of-the-envelope calculations that Russian officials will give you, is something like 16% of the overall population. It's 21 million people. But because Russia's Muslims divorce less, because they drink less, they use drugs less, they procreate more, they're on track to account for a fifth of the population by the end of the decade. And then further into the future, you see differing numbers that suggest, well, if not parity, then certainly an expanding political and demographic influence on the part of Russia's Muslims. And this is, by the way, not a negative population per se. I ascribe totally to what Michael talked about the fact that, you know, we shouldn't just label Muslim populations as, you know, they're radical or they're potentially radical. But what you're seeing, at least in Russia's Muslim population, is worrying because you're seeing a systemic, state-abetted, if not state-promoted, xenophobia, racism among the Russian population, lack of economic opportunity, corrupt regional governments in these restive regions translate into an atomization of Russia's Muslims and a increasing receptiveness to foreign Islamic ideas, right? And this is why you see, for example, in broad daylight, the attempted assassination of moderate Islamic officials in places like Kazan in Tatarstan, which is what happened last summer. You see sort of the increasing prevalence of Al-Qaeda banners in broad daylight, you know, sort of running through the streets of Russian regional capitals, right? This is a warning sign of something bigger that's coming, and coming relatively soon, given the demographic trends. And this has an impact on, already has had an impact on the South Caucasus, and it's likely to have a bigger one, right? We know that, you know, over the last decade or so, the type of disorder that has typified Russia's struggle against radical Islam has impacted Georgia, it's impacted Azerbaijan, and you can imagine more of the same as Russia fights this war, and as Russia increasingly gets outpaced demographically by a restive ethnic minority, religious minority. And the third point is, and so we talked about Russia, and we also talked about Iran. Iran is the third big fly in the ointment here. And I'd like to point out that, you know, it's a fly in the ointment for practical political reasons that exist today because of Azerbaijan's, for example, potential role in the prospects of an Israeli military strike against Iran, for example. But it's also an ideological and historical challenge to Iran, an independent Azerbaijan is. Azerbaijan is a challenge to Iran demographically because there are more ethnic Azeris inside the Islamic Republic than there are in the entire Republic of Azerbaijan. So the specter of separatism among Iran's Azeri community has always loomed very, very large on the screens of Iranian officials, and that has sparked over time a move to sort of to Islamize and radicalize that common border, right? To repress Iranian Azeris and depress their political mobility and economic opportunity, but also to step across the border and to seed Iranian ideas into southern Azerbaijan for a very, very simple reason. Because Iran believes, and I think with some merit, that the best scenario is that if there is separatist tendencies among this population, they would rather have it move from north to south, Azeris breaking away and joining Iran, than the reverse, because that would mean the fragmentation of the Islamic Republic. But it's also, Azerbaijan is also, I think it should be stated, a historical wound to Iran, right? Iran has, the 1813 Treaty of Gulistan ceded what is modern-day Azerbaijan and also parts of Georgia to Russia. And that is, this is a regime that, although it is a political newborn, right, it's only been around for 33 years, it has a very long historical memory. So, it doesn't take long in discussions with Iranians about Azerbaijan to have an allusion to historical grandeur and to lost lands. Very much the same way you have that when you have that experience with, when you have that conversation with the Russians. And I would also point out that in a strategic sense, this idea, the idea of defeating separatism, which is a defensive idea, and the offensive idea of expanding Islamic revival in favor of the Islamic Republic of Iran, are part of a larger northern strategy that the Iranians have been pursuing for the better part of a decade, right? It involves not only pressure on Azerbaijan, it also involves militarization of the Caspian Basin, it also involves their attempt, not fully successful, but their attempt to get involved in what is colloquially known as the great game for Caspian energy, and as a result, to dilute, at least partially, the effectiveness of Western sanctions. So on all these fronts, I think it's important to understand that, even though the South Caucasus seems remote to us, maybe not to the people in this room, but certainly to most Americans, it is not remote to our adversaries, whether it's Russia or whether it's Iran. And this gets me to my last point, which is, it's useful to map out the problems ahead, right? The first, one interesting evolution of the type of policy that you've seen towards, for example, Iran, has been that, there's an axiom in warfare that the enemy also gets a vote. And the change in Iranian behavior as a result of the economic pressure being applied by the West is having international effects, not least in the South Caucasus. I'll give you an example of this, from a region totally outside the scope of this conference. But if you were to spend, I've spent over the last couple of years quite a bit of time in Latin America, looking at terrorism, radicalization, also Iranian presence. And one of the interesting phenomena that you're seeing in Latin America, or at least beginning to, has been that as Iran has become embroiled in the Syrian civil war, they've had less money to spread around, less money to provide to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is changing its activities. It doesn't mean Hezbollah is going out of business, but Hezbollah is becoming more and more reverting to its original version, which was to be a narco-trafficking organization and also a terrorist organization. I highlight this for you. I understand it's completely on the periphery of everything we're talking about, but I highlight this for you because I want you to understand that in this context, what the West does or doesn't do has an effect on the regional security dynamic. And what you see is an uptick in activity, and different activity by Hezbollah, and you're also seeing very clearly an uptick in activity by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, including, as Ariel pointed out, in the South Caucasus. The big unknown in this discussion is whether or not peace has broken out all over the place now that Hassan Rouhani has made his charm offensive, ventured to Turtle Bay, and had lunch in close proximity to a whole bunch of officials, although not our president. This is an interesting question. It's certainly one that, given the track record of U.S. and Western diplomacy with Iran, I don't think we should be holding our breath for some sort of massive détente. But I do think that from the Iranian perspective, the breathing room that is afforded by even tactical negotiations that may break down several weeks or several months down the line provide a strategic benefit. A strategic benefit not only for their nuclear program, but for how they are postured regionally, and including in the South Caucasus. This gets us to what U.S. policy should be. I'm getting the hook, so I'm going to stop. What U.S. policy should be. And let me ask a provocative question here. That question, what should U.S. policy response be to radicalism in the South Caucasus, presumes that we care. We Americans care. We care. We do care. But overall, the South Caucasus ranks, well, frankly, very low on the strategic agenda of the United States. increasingly low as the U.S. is undergoing this period of retraction. Because, by the way, it's not localized to Afghanistan. You see this sort of strategic retraction occurring in the Middle East. You see it occurring in Central Asia. This is a uniform retraction of U.S. foreign policy. So the question really becomes, what comes next? What comes in the absence of an American strategy? Svante talked about the fact that sort of as we step down, the Europeans are stepping up. There's benefits to that approach. There's also lots of problems to that approach, which we can talk about offline. But I would point out that there is at least a tactical commonality with countries in the region and also with Russia that we can discuss. And that is the discussion of terrorism, as Michael talked about, as a bridging vehicle, one that can engage these countries even as we recede, even as our political priorities sort of more and more make the region or put the region on a back burner. So again, not to highlight too much or repeat too much, 0 minutes, I know. Not to highlight too much, I'm sorry, not to highlight too much sort of and steal too much of his thunder, but Michael made the point that we shouldn't wholesale highlight proxies and sort of, hit upon proxies. The natural instinct for the United States as we retract from this region and others is to find deputies that we can rely on to step in, right? And in the South Caucasus, Turkey looms very large as a topic of discussion. I think the events that have taken place in Turkey over the last 6 months should give at least some U.S. policymakers pause about whether or not the model of Turkish democracy is actually not only a model for democracy, that's a separate question, but actually a model that we want to get behind. And that is an open question, and it's something that I hope that we can discuss in the context not only of the South Caucasus, but also of larger U.S. policy in the region. Thank you.
Is it just me, or we really did not get a very prescriptive narrative for U.S. policy? This is what is going to happen now. I would like the audience to get engaged. However, we don't have much time, and there's lunch. So why don't we introduce ourselves, ask the question, pointed question, not a comment on your favorite cause, and then if you direct it to a specific speaker, please say who you're directing it to, and then the speaker will take also about 30 seconds to a minute to answer that question. How about that? Okay, first question, the gentleman with the green shirt over there. Introduce yourself.
Rafiq, graduate of University of Delaware. My question is about almost all the panel members talk about the role of Iran in radicalization of religious groups in the region. But I also noticed that the speakers effectively ignored the role of Saudi Arabia and also the Gulf Arabic countries' role in this whole process, in radicalization. Can you tell me about it doesn't exist or in our region, or it exists outside, let's say in the North Caucasus, so Syria or the Middle East, but doesn't exist in the South Caucasus? Thank you very much.
Okay. Anybody in particular you want to answer? Okay. Michael, how about you?
Sure. Yes, it does exist. Certainly when I've been in Azerbaijan, there's more concern about the radical movements coming from the North Caucasus, which perhaps have greater support from Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf than even to some extent those coming from Iran. It's one of those reasons why radicalism can't be a taboo subject and why it's also necessary to follow the money, because certainly with independence more than 20 years ago throughout the Caucasus, both Iran and especially some of the oil-rich states in the Gulf saw this as an open field upon which to plant the seeds of their own ideology. Oftentimes they will do that in another issue that needs to be looked at by giving scholarships to certain preachers to come, learn their wares, and then go back. And it's something that I think all the three countries are quite aware of.
Right. And in terms of my scholarship, I do not see any serious systemic policy opposition by our country to that practice. Temuri wanted to add real brief because I want other people to
take
ask.
the Ariel's job to sum up, but you know what you've seen actually it's very interesting. I know that Caucasus has a mountains and you have something called eco in the mountains, but what we are having in the South Caucasus is not primarily problem of the radical Islam, but secondary. It's an eco coming from Northern Caucasus largely, not originating necessarily in Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Turkey, and any other places, but more echoing on the North Caucasian slopes and coming to the South Caucasus.
Spillover, right? You're
echo.
talking about
Echo.
spillover. Like we have the regulars, but besides the regulars, is there anybody else? Okay, the lady over there. I want other people to have an opportunity. You asked your question before, but yeah.
Donna Stauffer, private citizen. My question, I guess, would be for Mr. Berman. You cite that U.S. Influence or engagement in the South Caucasus is withdrawing or retraction. Can you please provide some specific examples of that? I know foreign aid levels are declining, but are there other ways that you see U.S. being less engaged?
Well, I think it's a good question, and you know, I can certainly email you with sort of projects that have been at least floated and sort of canceled. But I think the point I was trying to make was that there is a larger image of a United States that's increasingly fiscally austere, increasingly struggling with the burdens of global leadership, and is increasingly pulling back. And in politics, image is reality, right? In a very real sense. And so there are a great number of projects, and include in particular, for example, energy projects in the South Caucasus that have continued. But the image of the United States is unmistakably one of, retreat is a bad word, but backward movement, movement away from engagement with the region. And I think sort of one of the hallmarks of this, and if you want a sort of a specific, not in the South Caucasus per se, although sort of abutting, was this less than stellar effort to craft something resembling a coherent strategy at the State Department called the Silk Road Strategy, right? Which had trouble even identifying what it is that the United States is seeking in the region. And that's, you know, part of that drift is sort of what I was alluding to, which is the United States has lots of tactical engagements in the region. And a lot of those, whether on a business level and a private sector level or on an official government level, will continue. But there is a sense of drift on a policy level.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. The gentleman was very patient. Thank you for your patience.
My question is to... Hello?
Yeah.
My question is to Mr. Berman. My question is to Mr. Berman. As the developments in that part of the world is happening, Iran is becoming a point of focus because of their ability and their strategic location to carry on and protect our interests in that area. When that happens, who will be the one that will perhaps resist such a relationship between Iran and America?
I know.
Well, this is a good question. I'm not sure I understood it exactly right, but to, you know, in the contrarian alternative future in which the United States and Iran have a grand detente, right, who would be disadvantaged by it? And I think the question really is, what are the contours of that detente? Because, you know, the nature of the deal makes a good deal of difference. If, for example, there is a tactical deal with Iran that enshrines some level of Iranian nuclearization and, you know, pockets the Iranian concession, which has been floated, that they would, you know, shutter the Fordo facility, but they will continue indigenous uranium enrichment processes and do all sorts of things, I think quite a lot of people will resist that. Because the logical end result of that is a nuclear Iran which will act hegemonically in the region. If there's some other formulation of a deal, others will.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're 10 minutes over time. I'm sorry. And Congressman Burton is here. Let's take 15-minute break for lunch. Grab the food, and you're welcome to come. Are they allowed to eat here? Yeah. Okay, you're welcome to come back here, and we'll start at 5 minutes to 1. 5 minutes to 1, we're back.
Thank you. Yeah, please do.